The cold seeps into everything here, into the wood of the barracks, into the frozen ground beneath, into the very air that carries no names, no voices, only silence. This is Siberia, 1945, and beyond these wire fences, beyond the official records that were carefully edited, beyond the maps that marked these places with innocent names, lies a truth that nations worked for decades to bury. They called them labor camps, filtration centers, re-education facilities, but the men and women who passed through these gates knew them by another name, the places where people disappeared, where histories were erased, where the ghosts of war were created not by bullets, but by bureaucracy, by silence, by the deliberate destruction of memory itself. This is the story of what Russia was hiding in the prison camps, and why some truths take generations to surface. When the Second World War ended in May 1945, the world celebrated liberation, but for hundreds of thousands of people, the war was far from over. In fact, for many, the worst was just beginning. Soviet prison camps had existed long before the war. The Gulag system had already swallowed millions of Stalin's enemies, real and imagined. But the war transformed these camps into something even more complex, more secretive, more deliberately hidden from history. As the Red Army pushed westward through Eastern Europe, they encountered millions of people whose stories didn't fit neatly into the narrative of heroic Soviet liberation. German prisoners of war by the hundreds of thousands, Soviet soldiers who had been captured by the Germans and were now suspect, liberated Allied prisoners who had seen too much, civilians from occupied territories whose loyalty was questioned,
political prisoners swept up in the chaos.
All of them disappeared into a system designed not just to imprison, but to erase. The numbers are staggering, and even today, we don't know the full count. At least 2 million German PA entered Soviet captivity, hundreds of thousands never returned. But it wasn't just Germans, Japanese soldiers captured in the final days of the war, Romanians, Hungarians, Italians, even some Americans and British who found themselves on the wrong side of the new Iron Curtain that was descending across Europe. But perhaps the most haunting category of prisoners were the Soviet citizens themselves, soldiers who had survived German captivity only to be branded as traitors by their own government, civilians who had lived under German occupation and were now suspected of collaboration. Anyone whose wartime experience made them inconvenient to the official story Stalin was constructing. The filtration camps were where this betrayal became systematic. Soviet soldiers liberated from German POW camps expected to return home as heroes. Instead, they were herded into transit camps where NKVD interrogators asked one question over and over: how did you survive? The implication was clear. If you survived German captivity, you must have collaborated, you must have betrayed your comrades, you must have been weak. Tens of thousands of these men, soldiers who had fought for the Soviet Union, who had endured unimaginable suffering in German camps, were sent directly to the Gulag. Their reward for survival was more imprisonment, more interrogation, more years stolen from lives already devastated by war. And their families were never told. A soldier would be liberated in Poland or Germany. His wife would wait for news, but no telegram came, no letter, no body, just silence. The kind of silence that could stretch for decades, that could last until death. That could become a family inheritance passed down to children who grew up knowing only absence. The camps themselves were designed for erasure, not just of people, but of evidence. Barracks built hastily in the remotest corners of Siberia, Kolyma, Magadan, Irkutsk, places so isolated that even the guards felt abandoned, wooden structures that would rot away within decades, leaving almost no trace, and the bureaucracy of death was equally disposable, records that were carefully kept, and then just as carefully destroyed. Declassified documents from the 1990s revealed the scale of this concealment. Entire categories of prisoners were listed only as numbers. German POW labor brigades whose existence was denied for 40 years. Mass graves that Soviet authorities knew about but never acknowledged. Death rates in some camps that exceeded 50%. And all of it hidden behind a wall of state secrecy that equated revealing the truth with treason. The Katyn Forest massacre provides a glimpse into how this system of concealment worked. In 1940, Soviet secret police executed over 20,000 Polish officers and intellectuals, burying them in mass graves. When the Germans discovered the graves in 1943, the Soviets blamed the Nazis. It took 50 years, until 1990, for Russia to finally acknowledge the truth. 50 years of official lies. 50 years of families searching for answers that the state possessed but refused to give. And Katyn was just one incident, one forest. Imagine how many other graves, how many other secrets, how many other lies were maintained with the same determination. Survivors who did eventually return carried their trauma in silence. Speaking about the camps could bring another arrest, another interrogation, another disappearance, so they learned to swallow their stories, to hide their past, to pretend that those years had never happened, and slowly, the memory of what occurred began to fade, not because it was forgotten, but because it was forcibly suppressed. Families searching for missing soldiers were told nothing, or worse, told lies. Your husband was killed in action, no grave, no details, just a stamp on a form that ended all questions, and if they pressed, if they wrote letters to authorities, if they demanded answers, they risked being labeled troublemakers, anti-Soviet elements, people whose questions were themselves dangerous. The psychology of this enforced silence created a second layer of imprisonment. Survivors carried the weight of untellable stories, memories that had no place in the official history, experiences that contradicted the narrative of glorious Soviet victory, and this internal prison, this psychological cage of enforced forgetting, was in some ways more cruel than the physical camps themselves. Children grew up sensing gaps in their family histories. A father who never spoke about the war, a mother who changed the subject when certain years were mentioned, photographs that were hidden, letters that were destroyed, and slowly, the gaps became normal, became part of the landscape of Soviet life, where everyone had secrets, where every family had ghosts that were never named. The camps served multiple purposes for the Soviet state. They provided forced labor for Stalin's reconstruction projects, mines and factories and railroads built with the bodies of prisoners. They eliminated potential political threats, anyone who had seen life outside the Soviet system, anyone whose loyalty might be divided, and perhaps most importantly, they controlled the narrative of the war. By imprisoning the witnesses, the state could write history without contradiction. Japanese soldiers captured in Manchuria in August 1945 spent years in Soviet camps, some not returning to Japan until the mid-1950s. A full decade after the war ended, their stories of captivity contradicted Soviet propaganda about humane treatment of prisoners, so those stories were buried in both countries. Japan didn't want to acknowledge how many men had been abandoned to Soviet captivity. Russia didn't want to reveal the conditions they had endured. American and British prisoners presented a different problem. Their governments knew they were missing, knew approximately where they had been when the Soviets overran German camps, but requests for information were met with denial, obstruction, deliberate confusion. Some were eventually released through quiet diplomatic channels, others simply disappeared into the system, and the Western allies, eager to maintain their wartime alliance, didn't press too hard for answers. The architecture of concealment extended beyond the camps themselves, train routes that didn't appear on maps, entire towns built around prison complexes that had no official name, guard units whose service records were classified, families of guards who were warned never to speak about where their husbands or fathers worked, layer upon layer of secrecy, creating a system where truth became almost impossible to establish. And when prisoners died, as hundreds of thousands did, their bodies told no tales, mass graves without markers, ashes scattered without ceremony, names that were removed from records or never recorded in the first place. Death became another form of erasure, permanent, complete, irreversible. The thaw after Stalin's death in 1953 brought some releases, some acknowledgments, but not transparency, not truth. Khrushchev's revelations about Stalin's crimes focused on Soviet victims, on loyal party members who had been wrongly imprisoned, but the German POs, the suspected collaborators, the inconvenient witnesses, their stories remained buried. It wasn't until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 that archives began to open, that historians could start reconstructing what had happened, and even then, many documents had been destroyed. Many graves remained unmarked. Many survivors had already died, taking their memories with them. What emerged from those newly opened archives was staggering. Documentation of camps that had never been acknowledged, prisoner lists that revealed the scale of captivity, internal memos showing that officials knew exactly how many people were dying and simply didn't care, reports detailing the deliberate destruction of records to prevent future accountability. Archaeologists and forensic teams began locating mass graves, using ground-penetrating radar, following rumors and whispered memories from local populations, and in forest clearings and remote valleys, they found the evidence, bones that bore witness to what had been denied for generations, bodies that had names once, identities, families, futures, all of it stolen and then hidden. The question that haunts this history is not just what happened. We know now, at least in outline. The question is why the concealment was so systematic, so determined, so complete. And the answer reveals something profound about power, about narrative, about the way states construct their legitimacy. The Soviet victory in World War II was the founding myth of the Cold War Soviet state. It justified decades of dictatorship. It explained sacrifice. It unified a diverse empire under a single story of heroic resistance and ultimate triumph. But that story required simplification, required heroes and villains, required a clear narrative arc from suffering to victory, and the messy reality of what happened in the camps, the moral complexity, the betrayals and abandonments and pragmatic cruelties, all of that contradicted the myth. So the witnesses had to be silenced, not just prevented from speaking, but erased entirely, because their existence, their memories, Their questions threatened the foundation of state power. Truth became the enemy, memory became dangerous, and silence became policy. The families who waited for soldiers who never returned, who died without knowing what happened to their loved ones, who spent decades wondering if perhaps somewhere their father or husband or son was still alive, they were casualties too, victims not of bullets but of state-manufactured ignorance, of deliberate cruelty disguised as bureaucratic procedure. And what of the survivors who did return but couldn't speak, who carried their trauma in silence for 40, 50, 60 years, who finally in old age began to share their stories and found that younger generations didn't believe them, didn't want to hear, preferred the simplified narrative they had been taught? What kind of violence is it to survive, and then be denied even the acknowledgement of your survival? The German POWs, who returned to their families in the 1950s, found themselves in a different kind of silence. West Germany didn't want to dwell on their suffering. East Germany couldn't criticize the Soviet Union, so their stories too were marginalized, forgotten, buried under Cold War politics and the desire to move forward rather than look back. Today, more than 80 years after the war ended, researchers are still uncovering new evidence, still finding unmarked graves, still interviewing the last surviving witnesses, who are now in their 90s and hundreds, racing against time to record memories before they vanish forever. But the ghosts remain, in the forests of Siberia where wooden guard towers have rotted away, in the archives where gaps in the records speak as loudly as the documents that survived, in the families who still don't know what happened to their ancestors, who have absence where there should be history. The camps were designed to erase, and in many ways they succeeded, not completely, not perfectly, but enough that even now, we're still discovering the scale of what was hidden, still calculating the cost, still trying to reconstruct lives that were deliberately obliterated from the historical record. This is what Russia was hiding in the prison camps, not just the deaths, not just the suffering, but the systematic destruction of truth itself, the weaponization of silence, the transformation of memory into a state security issue, where what you remembered, what you witnessed, what you survived, could be erased as efficiently as a name crossed off a list. And the haunting question that remains is this: if it took this long to uncover what happened in these camps, if it required the collapse of an entire political system before archives could be opened, if even now we don't know the full truth, what other histories are still buried, what other ghosts are still waiting, what other truths have nations decided are too dangerous to acknowledge? Because the camps themselves may be gone, the wire rusted away, the barracks collapsed into snow, but the principle they represented, that power can erase truth, that states can make people disappear not just physically but from history itself, that silence can be enforced across generations, that principle remains, and it whispers a warning that the most dangerous prisons are not made of wood and wire, but of enforced forgetting, of official lies, of truth that dies because no one was allowed to speak it. The ghosts of these camps still haunt us, not because of what they suffered, but because of what they know and what we chose not to hear.